So Casey, welcome to Pioneer Park. Casey Rodarmor, one of the most prolific contributors of open source projects that I've met in my life. Um, Most recently, or perhaps most recently, well known for your project Just, a command line util, making lots a pure Rust implementation of a command line util, making lots of basic command line processes much more simple and a previously contributor to Bitcoin Core, the creator of ordinals, which was the NFT equivalent for Bitcoin or the NFT implementation for Bitcoin. You could correct me on all these things in just a moment if I'm getting them wrong.
No, you're doing good. I mean, my modesty requires that I say that I'm not actually that prolific an open core contributor compared to others, but it's from your perspective, so I'll take it.
Sure. And of course, your most recent project, filepack, which is about metadata on the internet, another open data initiative about decentralized contributions to large libraries of metadata from all the media we consume.
Yep,
Um, yeah,
yep.
lovely to see you here, Casey. And I think that like I invited you to this conversation. The topic of our conversation today is the death of the programmer.
Right.
And
Which, has I think has been greatly exaggerated as we'll sort of spin out in this conversation. But it's a good starting point. People
yeah,
are really
yeah.
yapping, there's a lot of hype, you go on Twitter, you see a lot of confusing, contradictory things about the state of AI. So like the death of the programmer, like question mark is like a pretty good place to start.
Yeah, I've had a lot of my conversations on Pioneer Park over the last few weeks have been about people looking into the future and trying to discern what the role for themselves will be as these technologies improve. Another class of conversations has been people feeling like enabled and like they have wings in a new way, able to accomplish and have more scope than they've ever had before in their lives. I kind of put myself in both camps. Like I feel that I have been more enabled by these technologies than at any point. I think I saw a post that of somebody saying they had written more code in the last 6 months than they had written in their entire career before then.
Mm,
And I think if you were to measure contributions by like lines of code, that might be true for me as well. It's
yep.
like obviously that's not a sufficient metric, but it's definitely one measure. Um, and then on the flip side for myself, looking into feeling like a lot of the craftsmanship of this discipline has been squeezed out of it or is being actively squeezed out of it, and feeling like a sense of aesthetic loss for what I used to find beautiful. And I think that applies to a lot of things in which that AI touches. Uh, but yeah, curious to sort of throw and explore those topics with you.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts. Do you want me to just like start yapping or do you want
Go.
to?
Yap away. Let's see.
Yeah, so like I definitely fall into all of these camps, but I think the thing that I have to say is that I think that the LLMs are still producing slop. Like they're still slop machines, and that hasn't changed. I find that the code they write and even other things like when they do administration tasks or they write configs, it's just like oftentimes like twice as long, twice as indirect, twice as ugly as code that I would write myself. And so I find that I still do a whole lot of having to manage the models. And it's still kind of at the point where it's not totally clear to me for a lot of tasks that having the model write it is a net, having the agent write it is like a net benefit. There's certain things that it's definitely useful for, that I definitely find a lot of value for, these very like specific narrow tasks that it's very good at. But the sort of larger stuff, the things outside of those tasks I'm not sure about. So the things that it's very good at is I find it very good at writing tests. Um, in almost all of my projects, I have a ton of tests that I write, and they follow a very sort of fixed format. They're usually I write for each project, I'll write sort of like a test builder where you can say all the preconditions that you want and all the post conditions, and then you like just do test.run, and then it like does the test. And it's great to have the AI, the agents write the test because I can just write the feature and then I have a slash command slash test. I don't even give it like a proper prompt, and it just figures out like what the current branch is doing, what the current feature is, what gaps in test coverage exist, and it just fills those in. And it usually gets them right. And if it's wrong, I can figure it out and I can make it better. And one of the crucial things about tests is that they're leaf code, right? They're code that's at the edges of the graph that doesn't have any dependencies on that code. So although they're very important for the the big graph of the program, if they're ugly, if they're twice as long, even if they maybe break in the future in some weird way, it's just not the same as nodes in the middle of the code graph breaking, right? Like if you write an ugly interface and then all of a sudden you have to do like a massive refactor, like that's really bad, or it could like just waste a lot of time. So great for writing tests, incredible for debugging. I have like one command which is like /fix, which just gives it like a prompt to tell it to figure out any like compilation issues or test failures, and that it works really good at. Sometimes its fixes are like shortcuts. It's like, oh, like this test is breaking, like let me just like pretend that it passed, or like remove this thing or whatever. But like that's very useful. It's very useful for Linux system administration tasks, like shockingly good at this. And this is like one of the things that I think that it is really better than me at, like very clearly better than me at. But it kind of like lacks direction, even with all of these tasks, right? It can do this very narrow task, but it can't do a multi-step task that requires any sort of judgment between each step. So I felt like, in terms of the way that I've felt about these agents, I've, initially I did have some feelings of like, oh my God, I'm a programmer. The agents are going to replace me. And then further thoughts of like, oh my God, they're actually not. Like they're actually still like slot machines. And I think the current round of hype is just like a diffusion effect, right? Like that the models have gotten good enough, and then we've seen a sort of sudden diffusion of those capabilities through people using them, and not like a stepwise change in the capability of the models. The models, from my point of view, are still kind of asymptotically plateauing, but you can write some good harnesses for them. You can write some good coding agents, and then all of a sudden you get these jumpwise, apparently jumpwise increases in capability, when in fact the models have just been like sort of smoothly asymptoting up, which is kind of where I see them. And so I don't really feel that like existentialness, anymore. But I sort of decided that even if they did get really good, I mean, like it would be lit if I had an employee that was as good as me as writing code. Like that would be lit. An employee that was as good as me and as fast as me, and I could just tell it to write code. And I think I would probably come to peace with that pretty quickly. I would be like, okay, like now I can just get all my ideas out into the world faster, and I can write code that's like really good. So I think it'd be okay with it if it did happen, but I still kind of don't see it going in that direction.
And for the record, what are the current tools that are kind of in your tool belt? When you say it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that, what are you Claude Code as a cursor? What's your kind of tool belt look like right now?
Almost entirely Claude Code. I use Vim, and so I've never gotten like a LLM like integration into my coding environment that was like really good. So yeah, Claude Code. And I have a server that I run Claude Code on, that running an agent on a server that you don't care about completely changes your relationship with the agent. It means that you don't have to babysit it. You can just let it go. You can give it in its system prompt. Like in the system prompt, I have like, this is a sandbox for agents for your use. And that makes it a little bit more, have a little bit more ownership of what it's doing and ownership of the box. I added that after I was like, hey, can you disable the root password so that like root can't log in? And it gave me, the bullshit, like, oh, that's outside of the scope of whatever. Yeah. And then I was like, no, it's not. This is sandbox. It's fine. And then it was like, okay, let me do it. And then I added that to its prompt. But anyways, like, yeah, Claude Code on a server. And I'm sort of writing my own version of OpenClaw using as little code as possible and as much vanilla Linux tools as possible. So I have a NixOS server. My basic theory is that like OpenClaw is like a bloated mess, and you can get everything in OpenClaw with like probably like a total of like 1,000 or like 2,000 lines of code and configuration. So I have an email integration. I just run postfix, which is like the standard email server, and I have like very heavy restrictions so that it only lets Casey@rodarmor.com send to it. You can only send to root at the domain, and it uses DKIM and like message signing. Like email supports this optional message signing authentication mode. So it actually is signed by both servers, and that just goes to the root agent. That just goes to a root agent, and every thread gets its own like session directory, and so I can just email it, right? And because it's just email on a Linux box, this is like 25% of what people want from OpenClaw, right?
Totally.
They want to just message their agent, and this gets you that with a nice app on your phone, like the Gmail app, and it's like 200 lines of like configuration or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of the tool in my toolbox, and I always try to be a little more aggressive in my use of AI than is actually useful to me at the time, because I don't want to, get left behind. I don't want to be cynical and then miss out on some huge improvement in AI. So, and it is fun to experiment with. So I'm always kind of doing a little bit more than I actually think is really useful. And the server is an example of it. Yep.
Interesting. I'm curious, another kind of like high level question. In your contributions, like in open source and like the projects that you've chosen to work on, they've like one of the consistent themes I think is about, maybe we call it like leaf node enablement and decentralization.
Mhm.
And what is it that draws you to a project to make you want to like own this and contribute to it versus, another project? Like instead of compiling data sets against these like open source data sets for open source models to train on, like contribute doing the just command line project. How is it that you kind of choose a project or like have found your zone of genius?
Zone of genius. My zone of genius is very small. It has its moments, but so Just was pretty random. Just is a command runner. It has syntax that's almost exactly like make, the build tool, except it has all of the build tool features of make like stripped out. So and it avoids all of make's idiosyncrasies. It has very good error message. It's basically statically analyzed. It's more like a like Rust than like JavaScript, right? In the sense that it doesn't sort of just evaluate things at runtime and you make a typo and it errors. It statically analyzes everything up front and figures out what recipes you're going to want to run up front and everything. And that was totally accidental. I was using make as a command runner. I had done some projects in C and C++ in university, and so I'd gotten used to having a make file. And if you do that, you automatically find that it's very useful to put other commands in there that aren't strictly build commands. And you do that for like a couple of years, and then you realize that it's very like you have these weird idiosyncrasies of make. You have to do .phony recipes, which is a way of telling make like, oh, this thing does not produce a file output, like run it unconditionally. And then very specifically, I got irritated that I had to be in the root directory of the project to run make. Like you have to be in the same directory as the make file to run the make command. And so I wrote a wrapper that was called J, that the only feature difference from make is that it had a file called, I think the file was originally called just, and it would CD up till it found the file called just, and then it would invoke it using make. It just shelled out to make. That is the first and most important feature of just. And so, over then like a couple years, I did this and I had all this whatever, and it was like this 10-line script, and it started to get one or two more features. Like it started to get the ability to pass arguments and some other weird stuff. And I eventually just started rewriting it in Rust because it was useful to me. I wanted to add more features. I'd kind of run out of.
What was it originally written in?
It's shell script. It was like a 15-line shell script. Just CD up until it found this file, and then it would execute it like make.
Got it.
So then I started writing it in Rust, and I added like more and more features and very good error messages and all this stuff. And then at some point, I don't know exactly how, because I didn't start out being particularly interested in. I didn't write it to get a big audience. I sort of wrote it to like scratch an itch. But then at some point I was like, well, I guess, other people might like to use this. And so I did like a lot of like active shilling, every time I would have a release, I would go on r Rust on Reddit, or I'd like post on Hacker News or something. And I'd be like, hey, like just version whatever is out. And then if you look at the star graph on GitHub, it's just been like crazy. There's been a few like inflection points where it even sped up the rate of it getting stars. And so I think it just scratched an itch that other people had. And it continues to get a huge number of features. Like it's quite crazy at this point. Like it has a module system. It has, what does it have? It has these like static evaluation features. It has this like, expression language. It has all these built-in functions. It can load like N files. Like it's huge. But the funny thing is that I still use it mostly for just the small, core. Like 95% of the features of Just I don't actually use. They're just things that users want, because they have increasingly like Byzantine Just files that they're like, oh, my Just file is like, 10,000 lines long. Can I break it into modules? And I'm like, you're what? Like, this is like, that's not like, almost an appropriate use of Just, but like, okay, like, and like people are like, our startup runs off of Just. Like we have like an events company, and whenever somebody wants to do something with an event in the system, that like translates to some Just invocation, or like our startup is deployed on Just. Like everything is in like a master Just file, and I'm like, and a lot of the time I don't see those Just files because they're in some like company.
Sure.
But I'm like, all right, like I guess we need a module system, to help these people break up their like insane Just files. So that was like pretty random.
How do you
And-
balance, I guess, your own aesthetic drive with the project versus the input from others?
So I make sure that nothing ever gets in the way of all of the sort of core features. Everything about Just that you don't use can be completely ignored. I mean, just completely ignored. Like, there are features that they just don't bother you. And I don't make anything else worse. And Just has an extremely strong commitment to backwards compatibility. Like it does not break compatibility. I forget when I released 1.0, but it's been years. And even before that, I think there were only 2 breaking changes in the pre 1.0 release. One thing that was related to the syntax of assignments, there was like a conflict in the grammar, so I had to change that. And one thing that related, I think, to automatic loading of .n files, although I don't remember. So that also helps, right? I'm never like tempted to like churn the language to like support some weird additional feature. But then also like it's fun to think about these other like more complicated features and figure out how to make them work. And I do very much like shipping features for users, even though they're things that I don't personally use. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, that's Just. And then as far as other projects, I really hate the government. That's like a pretty core driver. Like I think that the government, and not just the current government, past governments, government in general.
Not like it's not even the government, it's government.
I hate government. That's very true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like it's partly for like a sort of like maybe what you'd call like ideological reasons. Like I just don't, I'm like a anti-authoritarian kind of guy. I never liked authority very much. But as I get older, I still hate the government, but it's like more like pragmatic. It's more like, well, I think most of the thing that the government does is like just bad, and just like stupid and inefficient, and we'd just be better off if they did not do those things. That I see the useful scope of government as being like more as being like very limited from a pragmatic point of view. And so things that involve peer-to-peer file sharing, I've always hated intellectual property. I hate intellectual property more than the government. I mean, I think intellectual property is completely crazy. So then money, the way that fiat currency works, the way that it's like this crazy tax on everybody, this crazy like savings tax, I think is quite insane. So anything that sort of is related to that those are the things that I tend to be like, Just was random, when I think about like, oh, what would be interesting for me to do? What would I be motivated to do? It's things that make a difference on those fronts that I find most motivating.
And not to dwell on it too much, but what were the sort of like formative, either like books or worldview changing things that kind of informed you on the ideological standpoints you have? And then like follow on, like using technology as a way to kind of like see those enacted.
I don't know where I got my loathing of intellectual property. I remember being like, I don't know how old I was. I was like maybe like 13 or 14, and just like sort of thinking about how ridiculous copyright was. Like, oh, like I'm gonna be on a desert island, and like a book is gonna like wash ashore, and like I don't know what the scenario I concocted in my head, but like the government would tell me like, no, you can't copy that, or a piece of software I'd have a CD with a piece of software on it, and I can just use it, and I don't view that as something that involves anybody else. I don't think it involves the creator, but that the creator of the software would be like, no, don't have the right to do that. And thinking about it over the years, I mean, I think that the thing about copyright in particular is that it's so far from its intended purpose in just a crazy way. I mean, like fundamentally, I think the only justifiable view on copyright is that copyright is a negative that we accept in exchange for encouraging more publication and more enjoyment of works, of useful, creative and scientific and informational works. That's the only reasonable thing. Otherwise, it's just a transfer to these particular industries for like no reason. It's that we have this like negative, which is that these works are like less available and less free, and you have to pay to use them. But then this positive that there's like more of them. Like that's the only justification. And there's so many things about copyright that's totally insane. Like you get copyright automatically and you don't have to do anything for it. So things get copyrighted that people don't even really care to copyright or wouldn't even really bother to copyright. They're sort of copyrighted automatically, which winds up being speculative. Like they're speculatively copywriting it. When in fact, you only want to have things be copyrighted that if they were not copyrighted, they would not have been created in the first place, right? So there's no reason to grant copyright automatically. And it doesn't have to be hard. Just make them fill out like a web form or whatever. The length of copyright is totally insane. I forget, it's like life of the author plus 70 years. When the vast, like 99.9% of all of the revenue that's generated from copyrighted works is done in the first like 2 years. And so you could have like a 10-year copyright period that would get you 99% of the incentive to create works. But then like, all this great stuff from like 10 years ago would already be in the public domain, right? We wouldn't have like ancient shit. So we would be accepting less negative to get all of the positive. You shouldn't be able to copyright secrets. The whole point is that you are encouraged to publish it. So if you're not going to publish it, if your strategy is to keep it secret, you shouldn't be able to get a copyright for it. Like that's a valid strat, but doesn't get you copyright. So for copyright, just like thinking about it over the years, and I forget what did it with money. I think it was, I took a micro econ class in community college from a great retired Shell oil executive named Vernon Lee Prescott, who was like great. He was hilarious.
What a name.
And yeah. And that really like, I think micro econ gives you really useful tools to think about the world. And that class made me just be like, wow, like markets work, and everything that works can kind of be explained in terms of markets, and a lot that doesn't work can be explained in terms of market failure, insufficient competition usually, or externalities or whatever. And government money seems like massive market failure, right? It's just, we want people to save, yet we like print money. We don't want people to have to change their menus every day, their menu prices every day, but we like print money. We print money unpredictably, so people have to pay attention to the money printer. It's not just like stable. So yeah, a lot of it was just like thinking to myself. I don't think that there was like a big like, oh, I read like, XYZ and then I, got these ideas.
Sure.
Just sort of like, noodling,
When I guess how early into Bitcoin's like life as a project did you get involved? And I guess what attracts you to it versus projects like Monero or projects like, other things that have claim to compete with it, things that claim to be technologically superior, etc.
I got interested in Bitcoin, I think, in 2013. And my very, very, very brief stint as a Bitcoin Core contributor, I think, was in 2014. And I just read a bunch about Bitcoin, and I think I ran a node for like 10 minutes just to like be like, okay, yeah, it works the way it says it does. I see the blocks, you know. Um, the Casey Rodarmor haters on the internet are going to clip this and be like, oh, Casey never ran a node. I run a node now, all right. And I was just able to very quickly convince myself, not very quickly, I mean, it took like a couple months of reading like Reddit and blog posts and stuff like that. I was just quickly able to convince myself that it worked, that it was like, okay, I can see how this works. There aren't any big question marks, or I think the big question marks are kind of manageable. And it's a very simple system. Conceptually, it's a very simple system. It has all these details to it, but those details, you can sort of ignore them. They're like additional features, and they're not important for conceptually understanding the system. And all these other cryptocurrencies, like, man, they're so complicated. They're so complicated, and they have these like weird assumptions, and they have this like privacy cryptography is like an awesome idea in theory, but it tends to be incredibly complicated. Like it just like incredible trade-offs and incredible opportunities for bugs and weird, like, Monero in particular has this sort of like statistical privacy where they're like, okay, like, you're going to pretend that you're all these other outputs, right? But what happens if you like pick the wrong outputs and people know that they've been spent or whatever? So these like probabilistic guarantees that make me really uncomfortable. But overall, I would say like I try to be a very practical person, and I'm very drawn to the things that work and the things that I can understand. Um, and I think sometimes there are things that are complicated but work. Certainly that is sometimes the case. But oftentimes the complicated things are just bad. And I would say like, all the other crypto projects are just long-term number go down technology that the main reason that they exist is so that somebody could mint a token. And they have no utility and they're not interesting like beyond that, and mostly they're just sort of like a form of like regulatory arbitrage, so you can pretend that you're doing a blockchain and get the regulators to leave you alone. But yeah, Bitcoin, it's simple, it works, and it is a like inflation, the monetary schedule as well, right? That it's like inflation resistant. Like I think one of the most interesting things about cryptocurrency is that it provides an alternative to government money. And if there's any sort of inflation that's like not super interesting, or any sort of like, insider allocation that's not super interesting. So yeah, mostly just simplicity, and it works.
I guess I'm curious to follow up on two things. The first is companies like, I think a lot of people, especially in the early days of Bitcoin, were very much attracted to it because of promises of anonymity, the idea that it wasn't linked directly to known identities, things like that. And obviously, that's one of the major attractive points of Monero and a lot of the community. Bitcoin in particular, like, if you reverse engineer it, the fact that like wallets can all be traced and you can kind of see the entire tree, I think really does dramatically call into question like the anonymity value of it. In fact, it's like in many ways more public than any other bank account.
Yep.
And so I'm curious whether like how did that public component of it, is that something you view as a feature or a bug? And then the second part is the use of Monero and or Bitcoin by more sophisticated actors, whether that be things that are kind of like using it for pump and dump schemes and kind of like constantly playing with the volatility. Bitcoin, I think, explains the rise of a large number of like new teams and financial institutions that are essentially just using it for, high 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, quantitative trading techniques to bilk money from poor like what do they call them, hodlers,
Hodlers, yeah.
hodlers, right?
Right.
And then of course the other more nefarious use cases of state actors potentially using it to conduct large scale money laundering campaigns and things like that. So yeah, curious to kind of hear thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, so I mean the public aspect I think is definitely, I wouldn't call it a bug just because it's not like a unintentional thing. It's just how the system is designed and how the set of trade-offs work. But I definitely think it's a negative. Privacy is nice. I guess it does have the silver lining that maybe it makes it a little bit more palatable to regulators. You know, they're like, okay, it is pseudonymous. Yeah, I definitely think it's a bug. I think the most promising path towards privacy on Bitcoin is Lightning. Um, Sender privacy on Lightning is extremely good. You just can't tell where a Lightning payment came from, and there's things that you can deal with to get receiver privacy. You can have these like extra hidden hops in the transaction, so it goes to this sort of like front node, and then it knows how to route the last payment. And then there's also, you can also, you know, receive via Lightning, and then as a last step, send to yourself via Lightning. So you sort of dox your UTXOs that you're receiving to, but then you send, and sender privacy is good on Lightning. So the final destination after you transfer it out is unknown. Yeah, and the like nefarious actors using it, I think is like bad. Like that's clearly bad. Like I'm not such a like libertarian that I'm like a North Korea maxi. You know what I mean? Um, and in fact, I think that's one of the most important function of governments, right? Is protecting you from other governments that have a worse stance on freedom, right? So you don't want to like minimize your own government because you're a libertarian until like Putin invades you, and then you get a new government which is like not very libertarian at all. So yeah, I think it's bad. I think it's one of those things that it's just like one of those things that has trade-offs, right? Any powerful technology is going to be available to bad actors, right? North Korea has access to the internet, they have access to electricity, and it's like unfortunate. But then also I wonder, like, is it even worse than the existing financial system? Like the existing financial system is so opaque and so weird that, you know, does this actually make money laundering easier? Because you can like trace it, you can like see the movement on chain. I heard a crazy story about how there was like some bank heist. I'm gonna get all the details wrong, but like they successfully like transferred out, you know, like some number of millions of dollars from like a Malaysian bank or something, and then they couldn't find where it went. It was unsolved. They could, and I was like, what? It works that way? Like I thought that like it was just like you just trace that shit. You know, it's all in the system. You know, but it turns out that like no, once you send it, and then like you send it a few more times through like this like you know, this very opaque, you know, Swift or whatever like bank wire system, it just kind of gets lost in the shuffle. So yeah, I agree. It's bad. It's a downside.
It seems
But
like
like
the
go ahead.
well, with like projects like Monero, which like I was conceptually super excited about Monero because of like things like anonymity and like the promise of it being basically a digital equivalent to cash, which
Mhm.
I think is sort of what Bitcoin was thinking of itself in its inception. And I don't know if they had anticipated how closely tied or like all the KYC in like basically infrastructure that would be built up in front of the pseudonymous like account IDs.
Yeah.
Um, but the you know, the reality is I you got to stare the kind of like implications, the darker implications of the aesthetic desires in the face. It's like, oh, like what is the vast majority of the transactions? What are they actually for? Do I condone or want to be a part of communities that like do that? And I don't know the numbers, to be frank, on Monero and things like Bitcoin. But I bet a lot of it, probably a lot more than I'm comfortable with, is like for transactions that I'm like, I really wish that we had ability to like audit, or wouldn't it be nice if that didn't happen? That said, like I don't, to your question of like, is it any better or is it any worse than the current financial system? I think that's a fair question.
Yeah, and
How did
I imagine that probably a lot of the transactions, I mean, so 40% of the transactions on Bitcoin are runes, which is the shitcoin protocol that I made. 40% of
that
the transactions, if you go to the fucking mempool.space, you'll see these little tiny fly spec transactions, and those are all runes transactions.
and that is exactly what I wanted to ask you about next. Tell us about runes and ordinals.
Yeah, so I was it all started when art blocks started making a ton of money Art Blocks inscriptions started making a ton of money on Ethereum. So Art Blocks is a sort of curated collection of collections of generative art NFTs on Ethereum. And they started getting crazy high prices. I don't know when. It was like 2018, 19, 20, I don't remember. And I have made like a lot of programmatic generative art. And so I saw this stuff and I was like, oh damn, like I could make this stuff, you know, I could make all this money. And so I started looking into how Ethereum works, and I started looking into how NFTs work, and I wrote a Solidity smart contract to do like an NFT collection. And everything I found was just bad, like bad. Ethereum is like just fucking dumb. The semantics are dumb. The language is dumb. The smart contracts are dumb. On Ethereum, every single NFT contract is its own implementation of a smart contract, and so as a result, they're all different. And this is like you get a painting shipped to you in the mail, and you've got to audit it. You've got to audit the painting, and not just for like authenticity. You've got to audit the painting that it doesn't contain code that it's just going to like disappear, right? Like you've got to hire an auditor for your painting, an expensive one that can read Solidity. Like that's crazy. For every single one you want to buy, it's a new deal. You got to audit it again. And so I was like, I can't do this. Like I was like, I can't. Like yes, I could literally do this. Oh yeah, and then it's all stored on the moral equivalent of BitTorrent, right? It's all stored on IPFS, which is the moral equivalent of BitTorrent, which means that if seeders go away, the data goes away. And there's been many high-profile losses of data where some NFT company is like, well, we were in business and like keeping the stuff on IPFS, but now we're not in business anymore, so we're not going to do this. And you guys are all high and dry. And the buyers don't even know this. The buyers of the NFTs don't even know this. They think they're buying something permanent. They've been sold like art on the blockchain. The art was never on the blockchain, guys. Or it's stored on Arweave, which is like even worse than IPFS because Arweave is like going to collapse all at once, not like bit by bit, which is going to be fun. I'm like, I can't fucking wait for that. I can't like the I told you so tweets are going to be so lit. I'm just going to search for Arweave like in my tweet history and then have a big thread when it collapses, you know, and I'm going to reply with like all these like tweets. So it's just like I was just like I can't do this, and so I started looking on what could I do on Bitcoin, and I noodled for like a long time. I think I noodled and I wrote code for like a year, noodled and wrote code on my own, and I came up with the scheme that after I had come up with the scheme, I realized that it had already been independently invented or independently proposed in 2011, and it's just a scheme for pretending that the individual subunits of Bitcoin, the Satoshis, have an individual identity and flow through transactions from the inputs to the outputs. And the reason that this is an appealing scheme for Bitcoin is that just through standard Bitcoin transactions that don't have any additional data, by manipulating the order and amounts of the inputs and outputs to a transaction, you can manipulate the flow of these imaginary Satoshis through the transaction, unlike something that needs an op return or something that needs some other thing. And this is like perfect. This is like perfect for me because it had this like insane weird aesthetics and some like technical justification for why that it was a good idea. And the reason that it had been independently invented is that if you noodle on like how to do assets in Bitcoin and how to transfer them across transactions in a way that's like kind of Bitcoin native, and you noodle for long enough, you will eventually cook up a scheme like this because it's like it's in the bones of Bitcoin. It just needs the lantern to be to flash some light on it.
By virtue of the indivisibility and uniqueness of a Satoshi.
The indivisibility, not the uniqueness. Like they start out not unique, but they do start out indivisible. You do get the number of Satoshis in equals the number of Satoshis out. And so then you've just got to come up with a scheme for how the identity goes from the inputs to the outputs. And let's see. And the reason that I was like noodling on the Satoshi thing, like that doesn't get you art on the blockchain, but it does get you a vehicle for the art on the blockchain. And so the way that inscriptions, and that's called ordinals, and then inscriptions, which is the NFT protocol built on ordinals, creates a transaction that has the content in the transaction and assigns the content to one of these NFTs. And then so to one of these Satoshis, and then the Satoshi is the NFT. The
Got it.
Satoshi is the inscription. The Satoshi has the content, and if you want to trade the inscription, you do a transaction that moves the Satoshi from one address to another.
Where does the actual expression of the art of the underlying thing get stored? How does it actually get kept on the blockchain? What's the alternative to the Arweave/IPFS?
You just put it in the transaction. So Bitcoin has Bitcoin script, which is essentially like a predicate language that says, what are the conditions to spend this output? And it's a very small scripting language. And I do basically an unexecuted if branch. So it goes if false, and then like data. It has like raw data pushes. You can just include a binary string in a Bitcoin transaction. And because this if branch is unexecuted, none of that data affects the semantics of the transaction. So it gets ignored, and the transaction has its whatever requirements it had, like the signature. It requires a signature or whatever. So the data is very literally in the Bitcoin transactions, and very literally like stored in the blockchain in the most straightforward way you can possibly imagine. It's just in a field of the transaction.
Is there a limit on the complexity or size of the data that can be represented in that? Have there been use cases where you're like, oh my God, you're trying to store a whole movie there or something like that?
I mean, people would store a whole movie if they could.
Yeah.
I don't think that the limits are particularly significant. I think you can do whatever you want. And because you have access to HTML and JavaScript in these inscriptions, you can like, if you really want to, you can string inscriptions together out of multiple other inscriptions. You can like piece them together. So the limits are, I mean, you have to pay for it. It's not free. It is pretty cheap these days. And you can do 400 kilobytes of data in a single transaction without having to like pay a miner. And you can do between 400 kilobytes and 4 megabytes if you can pay a miner. So this is pretty much big enough for any kind of content that you would want to do on NFTs. You can't do movies, and MP3s are hard, but you can do whatever else you want. And then the inscriptions, when you go to ordinals.com, the fantastic Ordinals Explorer, inscriptions load inside of an iframe sandbox, and they have access in that sandbox to the content of other inscriptions. And so you can basically make, and people have made inscriptions that are kind of like whole web pages. Like you have a HTML inscription, and that loads in a sandbox, and then it loads by inscription ID, which is based on the transaction ID, some other inscription as the JavaScript. And there are copies of React that have been inscribed on the Bitcoin blockchain. There's like a Bitcoin public goods repo where people list all of the useful JavaScript libraries that have been inscribed, as well as like fonts. Oh, you want a font? Like, well, just inscribe the font and like reference it from another inscription. So the level of complexity is actually pretty like bonkers, and the size limits are totally reasonable and totally workable.
So this, I guess, it's interesting to think about how this intersects with the idea of being like with copyright or like lack thereof, because in some ways it like allows for somebody to claim or exhibit ownership in some way. At the same time, it becomes part of the public blockchain forever in a way that can never, ever, like as long as Bitcoin is functioning in any capacity, it can never be deleted.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one nice thing about NFTs is that they separate this concept of ownership from some intellectual property, right? Like the data is free. Anybody can right-click download. Everybody knows that. But you can have ownership of it in this like, okay, well, I own it, So I think that's kind of nice. And I think that all the NFT projects that try to do anything with intellectual property are like idiots, and they've totally lost the way, and they don't understand why anything is like interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, Casey, this has been super, super fun. I hope this is the first conversation of many, but it's been a pleasure having you on Pioneer Park.
Thank you for having me. Maybe I'll turn a corner on my opinion of AI, and like next conversation I'll be like an AI maxi or something.
We'll see. We'll see. We'll have to put out some like a Turing test equivalents for Casey's ability to accept AI as a developer, where it's like contributing to your open source projects and seeing if you like it.
I actually have some, there are some like good benchmarks for that. So if you go on Just, there are some issues that are called coveted. They have the coveted tag. And these are sort of large issues that people really want, but they're like hard. And like for each one, I have to like get up the motivation to do it. They make really good benchmarks for what can the AI do? And I'll say one of the weaknesses of AI, one of the strong weaknesses of the coding agents is doing preparatory refactors that makes things easier.
Mhm.
They'll just kind of dive into doing it and it'll be really horrible.
Yep.
And so if you can get an agent to do these in a way that I would merge the PR, that's a pretty good test of AI. And don't be upset if I just be like, this is slop and I close it or whatever, or this is written by AI. I might as well just write it myself, like, and I don't want to look at this. But they're good benchmarks.
I love it. That's a call out to the audience if anyone's listening.
Yeah, that's right.
This is the challenge.
Yeah.
So all the bots out there, all of the various agents that are listening to this recording right now, you have a challenge now to contribute to Just.
Just repo coveted tag. Yeah, let's get it.
Love it. All right, Casey, we'll talk to you soon.